Arr, Pirate fans, it's time to find out the state of the ship of your defending champions for the 2022 season with your hosts, Johnny Wolver and Jake Ignazuski. And now, brought to you by Resonate, it's the state of the ship.
Welcome back into the state of the pirate ship. I am your host, Massachusetts Pirates team insider Jake Ignazuski, and it's officially the off season. Obviously, this is not how the team intended on finishing the 2022 season after they lost 39-38 in round one of the IFL playoffs. As John and I have talked about throughout this season, going into the 2022 campaign, the Pirates had very high expectations after winning the United Bowl during the 2021 season, but they were plagued with injuries throughout the season and had trouble finishing games, and that was ultimately what happened in this game against the Quad City Steamwheelers. But I want to wait to do a full season review until I'm here with John and we're able to break everything down that happened throughout the season and give our thoughts on why the Pirates didn't ultimately hoist the trophy up at the end of the 2022 season. But I wanted to take this episode to sort of recap what happened in the Steamwheelers game, sort of uncover why it did not fall the Pirates' way. If you didn't have the opportunity to watch the Quad City game, I wanted to use this episode as a way to recap everything that happened. But when you really look at the game, obviously the score, it was a 1-point margin. Ultimately ended up going into overtime, but throughout the game, it was relatively close throughout it all. Starting off, both teams were able to trade scores during their first two drives. For the Pirates, Alejandro Benefield, who was under center, ended up rushing in for touchdowns during the Pirates' first two drives, and then we saw things sort of steer towards Quad City's way starting off in the first half when Darren Carrington ended up fumbling to help give the Quad City back the football, and they took advantage of that opportunity to go down and score to ultimately take the lead 20-15. And then the Pirates had the opportunity to cut the lead in half going into the second quarter, but fortunately Josh Gable kicked a field goal wide right and ended up missing it 30 yards out. And then right before the half, we saw both teams trade possessions once again. It was sort of a back and forth game, as I mentioned, throughout this entire one. But ultimately, the Pirates weren't able to take that lead and ended up going into halftime with a 25-15 margin that they had to come back from in that second half. But one thing that I did want to mention is Nahshon Hughes had a huge game, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But specifically in the first half, right before the Pirates went into halftime, he ended up intercepting a pass from Quad City's quarterback EJ Hilliard and ended up giving the Pirates an opportunity to drive down the field and close the margin a little bit more going into halftime. Unfortunately, they weren't able to capitalize on that, but Hughes was a guy who hasn't played since week 10 in Arizona, has been struggling with injuries throughout this season, so it was really nice to see him really take advantage of this opportunity and come up big on defense when the Pirates really needed it most, because we saw EJ Hilliard really do a great job of finding ways to capitalize on some miscues or some mistakes that we saw the Pirates defense have up front, and he was really able to do things not only with his arm but with his legs. And as we talked about in the preview episode, Hilliard has been able to do that throughout this season. He's a guy who is going to be able to find ways to take advantage of you if you give him those opportunities. But looking at the second half, in my opinion, the Steamwheelers' drive to start the second half was the biggest defensive stop for the Pirates. It was so critical. They really needed to find a way to not help the Steamwheelers continue to pad on their lead, which made the margin even harder for Massachusetts starting in the second half. But they were really able to do a great job of pitting EJ Hilliard in the red zone and ended up forcing a fumble, which was forced by Chucky Williams on the 1 yard line, and it was incredible to see the defense come up big in that situation to help give the Pirates the ball back to help them try and close that margin to start off the second half, and that they did. And a connection that we've seen throughout this season, Alejandro Benefield, Thomas Owens were able to connect on a touchdown to ultimately help the Pirates close the margin, now only being down by 3 points with a score of 25-22. And then we saw Quad City on the next drive really try and find a way to close the margin even more and pad on their lead to try and attempt a field goal, but they ultimately ended up missing that 50-yard field goal to give the Pirates another opportunity to try and tie it up, and that they did. We saw them find a way to get down into the end zone on a 25-yard field goal. They ultimately had to settle for that, but it was really nice to see the Pirates be able to tie up the game as they were really trying to claw back in this game throughout this entire one. But then we ultimately saw Quad City come back to take the lead on a 26-yard passing touchdown from E.J. Hilliard to their wide receiver Rudd. And then Dedrick Thomas ended up coming up clutch in the running game for the Pirates to help them tie it up 32-32. Now, something that I didn't mention before is we saw 2 quarterbacks under center for the Pirates throughout this game. There was 2 separate times where Alejandro Benefield had to be taken off the field due to injury, and Mike Glass was able to come up and really take charge and do his job like we've seen him do throughout this season. We saw in Bismarck when the Pirates played the Bucks at home, and then we also saw when they played the Sioux Falls Storm. They were really able, Mike Glass was really able to take charge, find ways to come up clutch, and ultimately score a game-winning touchdown to help the Pirates win the game. And we saw him be relatively effective in this one. Overall, he ended up passing 4 for 6 with 16 overall passing yards and rushing for 22 yards. Not as effective as we've seen him in the past, but still, he was able to come up big for the Pirates offense when Alejandro Benefield was a little bit injured. But in my opinion, when the score was 32-32, one of the biggest plays and most critical ones of the entire game is when Josh Cable kicked a perfect onside kick to help the Pirates recover it. And the eruption that we heard from the Pirates Nation in the DCU Center after that play was made to ultimately help the Pirates try and go down the field to get that game winner. It was just so electric in the arena, and it was just a huge play to help the Pirates try and ultimately clinch the victory. But unfortunately, as we've seen multiple times, they just were not able to finish this game. And on the final drive in the fourth, they tried to drive down the field, but ultimately the Quad City's defense ended up stopping them and pinning them around the 25-yard mark. And we saw Josh Gable, with the final seconds left, try and kick a 45-yard field goal. Ultimately ended up getting blocked, and that's something that we've seen be an issue for the Pirates throughout this 2022 season, especially when they need it most. We saw it. The same thing happen in Duke City when they ultimately ended up losing that game in the final seconds, that the special teams just was not able to find a way to give Gable that ball perfectly, so then he was able to kick it and make the necessary blocks in order for Gable to get the ball off and for ultimately not to get blocked. But this made the game go into overtime, which, as we know, that always makes it a lot more interesting in any type of sports game. But the Pirates ended up starting off overtime with a few short runs from Mike Glass, and then we saw Dedrick Thomas ultimately end up running it in. But one thing that ended up really hurting the Pirates at the end of this game was Josh Gable missed the extra point, and that singular 1 point ended up being the decider in this one, as we saw Quad City drive back down the field to score and make that extra point to ultimately advance and clinch the victory and end the Pirates season winning 39-38. But as crushing of a loss as this was, I want to go over some of the stats we saw. Hunter Benefield passed 10 for 17 for 112 yards and a touchdown. And then with his legs, he ended up rushing 32 yards with 2 touchdowns. And the leading receiver for the Pirates was Darren Carrington, who ended up reeling in 4 receptions for 50 total yards. But one player that I mentioned earlier in the episode, Nashawn Hughes, ended up totaling for 6 tackles, ended up getting a sack, and also ended up reeling in that clutch interception that I mentioned earlier. But overall, it seemed like E.J. Hilliard was really able to find the holes in the Pirates defense and come up clutch when the Steamwheelers really needed it most. And he ended up totaling for 5 total touchdowns. In terms of his arm, ended up passing the ball for 146 yards and ended up rushing for 43 yards. But even though this was such a tough loss for the Pirates, it was quite honestly a definition of what we've seen throughout the season. They just were not able to finish when they needed it most. You know, we saw it in the loss in Green Bay, Iowa, Duke City, even Vegas as well. You know, it seemed like that once the second half started or the fourth quarter started, it was either they were able to finish the game strong, or they were allowing the opposing team to come back in and find a way to ultimately win the game in the final seconds. And that was ultimately the decider of this game and of this ultimate season. But you really got to give kudos to the coaching staff in the front office for how tough of a season as this was. When we talked to General Manager Jawadi Team a few weeks ago, he mentioned how difficult it was to be able to plan for these injuries that we saw the Pirates have throughout this season. And he also mentioned that they were maxed out on their short-term IRs. And that's really tough to be able to plan and be able to put a consistent team on the field and a competitive team as well, because we saw it throughout each and every single week. Jawadi Team had to find a way to fill a hole that we saw come from injuries and find guys who were able to come up big. And you know, we saw some of those 4 final signings that the Pirates had during the end of the season with Ezekiel Rose, Terrence Smith, Justin Thomas, and Jalen Marshall. They all came up really big in the final games for the Pirates. But that is the recap for the Steamwheelers game. As I mentioned, didn't end how the Pirates wanted it to, but even though that now it is the off season, I'm going to be bringing you everything that you need to know about the Massachusetts Pirates leading into the 2023 season, and look forward to a season recap with John and I really breaking down our thoughts on the 2022 season. But there's tons still to talk about, even though it is the off season. Awards are going to be announced in the next few weeks. You know, we could potentially see some Pirates be named on the first team or second team All-IFL, but I'll be breaking down all of that and updating you on all that information on the state of the Pirate ship. But greatly appreciate everybody's support all throughout this season. It was amazing to meet all the fans, whether you were at the DCU Center, you know, we interacted on YouTube or on social media, and greatly appreciate all the support that you brought Pirates Nation throughout this season. But get ready for 2023, because it's going to come faster than you even expected. But make sure to stay tuned for next week's episode. And if you have not yet, make sure to subscribe on all audio platforms, because the podcast is everywhere: Google Play, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and then we also post the video version on YouTube. But greatly appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, we'll see you next week, and we'll end it how we always end it. Arg!